It's just money. No. I wrote a piece last week on Huffington Post that's in the Twitter feed for this event this morning. And I called it the real challenge for collective impact. And I identified 3 things that I think are real concerns as we do this work. And the first is about process. What I've learned from visiting some of the groups and talking to some of the groups doing this is I fear that as people are running to replicate this and rushing to replicate it, that they're like the Canadian walk signal more than the US walk signal. And to me, the issue is that it takes process and time and patience and community building. And what I noted in Cincinnati, for example, was that there were organizations that took a long time for them to cultivate and get to the table. And all those bodies didn't come together at first. It took time to engage them. And then in engaging them, they had to create a space where, as we said, the grassroots faith-based organization and the large, well-funded social service organization both had power at a table, where funders and grantees could talk honestly to each other, where bureaucrats were able to kind of engage in a different kind of way. And that didn't happen in a year. It didn't happen in 2 years. And most of the efforts that we've seen have involved government, nonprofit, business leaders, and others, philanthropists. But the process by which they build community with each other and build trust is as important as anything else. And if you do that wrong, we think the product's going to be wrong. The second concern I voiced is I'm worried about nonprofits doing what we call in the U.S. in education, teaching to the test. And what I mean by that is what's measurable isn't always what's right and what's best. And in an outcome-obsessed, so I'll give an I was in this neighborhood in Wilmington, Delaware last year, and I met this woman, and she was phenomenal. And she has almost single-handedly transformed one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. And when there's a fight in the neighborhood, the kids run get her. And you look in her eyes for 5 seconds, you know why. She got the school to change the whole relationship to the community. She got the principal and the teachers to get involved in the neighborhood they were working in. She built relationships among people. She did all this work. And you see how the kids respond to her. And you see how she engages with the kids in the neighborhood. And if you asked me, if you said you could have $500,000 to build a youth agency in this neighborhood, or you could have her, I'd pick her. But what's her outcome? What's measurable about developing a leader like that at a neighborhood level? And so instead we run programs with outcomes that don't necessarily do what she's able to do in building community, in building a sense among people that they're in it with each other. And crime, I mean, you could look. And my colleague, Maurice Lim Miller of the Family Independence Initiative, who's also on the White House Council, he's built a model of a nonprofit that fires any employee who's found to help anybody. All they're allowed to do is facilitate neighbors, families, and families helping each other. But what he's been able to show over time is outcomes have gone up in the neighborhood. Income's up, employment's up, crime's down. All the outcomes have moved, but not because of more programs, but because people are helping people. Now that's not, and he would agree that it's not an argument against services and programs, but it's challenging our way of thinking in a more metric-obsessed world, in a data and outcome-obsessed world, that we lose something when we obsess too much on that. And solving communities and getting communities to work is an art more than a science. And I think the scientists are dominating the profession right now. So that's my second caution. And the third I'll remember in a moment, because it was very important, of course. Well, I'm thinking, but that gives you a sense of some of the stuff that for me has been at the center. Like, I think we have to really think critically about this work and engage with it critically. And I think when it comes to the silos and all of that, it takes time. It takes process. We got to use data, but we can't be addicted to it.
I have a question about something you didn't touch on, an example of truly disconnected youth. And it's particularly relevant for us in Canada because this is a policy path that we have just decided to follow you down. And that is the issue of incarcerated youth.
Yeah.
The U.S. has one of the highest rates in the Western world, if not the highest. I think something like 1 million people, you know better than I do. But as we in this room know, most of us, the federal government has decided in its wisdom that that model of basically punitive justice is one that we should adopt, and particularly true for youth justice. And so I'm wondering, are there things that you've done that specifically address the problem of the large number of young people who are incarcerated and who are then released into society, presumably as extreme examples of youth without prospects?
Well, I'm just glad that Canada's seen our success because since we began punitive policies and building lots of prisons, our crime rate is so far lower. And it's just prevented lots of people from going down the road of shooting each other and dealing drugs and everything else. And so it's obviously, because we're metric driven, been such a phenomenal success that I'm glad people are finally replicating it. Because, you know, we learned from watching third world countries and we thought that that was working great. Dictatorial nations, and we thought that seemed to be working well for them. It's an insane pathway first. And all I can say is, and I'm joking a little bit, but I'm being serious. We have, like, what I don't understand is we get all this stuff about, oh, we have to use metrics, and then like there actually is clear evidence that's been a disastrous path that has had no bearing on crime at all. The rates in which young people go through that system come back, recidivism, are off the charts. And then it's like, oh, but we're going to ignore all the evidence and data in this example because it's scarier and gets more votes. I mean, that's insane. So I just have to say it because I think it's a huge problem in the United States. We're locking up young people for things we shouldn't be locking them up for. We also know, for example, from places like the Vera Institute in New York and others, that the alternatives to incarceration, when we don't lock them up, actually have higher success rates and cost 10% of what it costs to lock someone up. So here we go. We know we can have a 25% recidivism rate for $3,000, or we can have a 70% recidivism rate for $40,000. So we'll do the $40,000, 70% recidivism rate. It's crazy. Our criminal justice system is absolutely unjust. It's wrong. And as I said, there's absolutely zero evidence it's done anything but accelerate crime and problems. Because what happens, you lock young people up for minor offenses, they get out in a few years, they're now more disconnected from education, more disconnected from work, more disconnected from opportunity. What happens, they're more likely to commit another crime. And so, to me, I just can't say enough that it is not the path to follow. And for those young people who are incarcerated, you know, again, we have to be committed. If we're committed to disconnected youth, that's a big part of that disconnection. When the rates are as high as they are of young people who face that. We at Public Allies hire people who are ex-felons and have been incarcerated. We have no problem doing that. I should have been. I'll get to that in the second part. There's a little commercial for the second part. But I'm very passionate about that, but I think that the reality is that there's a lot of talent that's behind bars. And frankly, at least in the United States, a lot of it's drug-related, and if they lived in a suburban white community, it wouldn't happen. And I'll use an example of that came from a cover story in the New York Times about a decade ago that was following Los Angeles police on a beat, on a drug beat. And they asked the officers, because it was all about all these arrests they're making in South LA, which is the poorest part of Los Angeles, on their drug beat. And at one point, the reporter asked the police officers, if you wanted to, do you think this is the most effective way to reduce the amount of drugs in Los Angeles? And the officer looked at the reporter and said, if we wanted to make the single biggest dent on drugs in Los Angeles, we'd raid the dorms at UCLA. No one's doing that. And there's more drugs there than there are on the streets. So we have so a lot of the young people being locked up in our country are doing nothing different than kids who are much more privileged are doing. But it's putting them on an economic death sentence. And that's why for those of us who are focused on that population of disconnected youth, absolutely you have to take that into consideration, and we have to lower the barriers by which people look at that. And we did have policy recommendations in regard to that. And the National Council of Young Leaders we just created of young people who were formerly disconnected, who are advising this effort, it was one of their core recommendations was to look at the justice issue and make sure that punishment does fit the crime. So it's a huge issue.
I could listen to you all day. This is just crazy. This is great. Okay, we've got time for a couple of
The
questions.
whole apprenticeship system there, right? And from a young age, they put people on a path toward a future. Now, some may say that it's too restrictive because you're either considered professional ready or working class ready at a fairly young age and divided. So there's concerns with it. But they have the apprenticeship system there, which is very strong and solid and does not make that demeaning. The second thing that they do is they have a national service. Everyone has to serve a cause greater than themselves for a year when they come of age. And I think those are two aspects that a lot of us could learn from.
Is the
I just have to say, I don't study international, so I don't know how I know that.
could be a statistic then.
Yeah,
I'm curious as to whether or not, where we're seeing this situation where we're following you in criminal justice and youth criminal justice
Right.
particularly, is the result of that a failure of this sector, or is it a result of the success of this sector? The failure to not communicate what was really going on and why you need those changes, and our political people now are on a different path, or is it the success of this sector and we took it all for granted and we all went to sleep on it?
It's a very complicated question.
I'm a lawyer.
Megan, I need you right now. No, I think it simply has to do with the marketing of fear. And how do we offer hope to counteract that? We in America, I'll speak. One would think in my city, Milwaukee, that if they enter the city limits, they have a 50% chance of being a victim of a crime. They don't imagine how anyone could even go into or drive through and get out their car in neighborhoods that people live in every day. Because we've painted a picture that makes people feel that it's all about fear, and that fear is coming toward you, and we have to stop it off. It's a very easy thing to sell, unfortunately. And so I think that, yes, we have to tell a different story. And I don't think as a sector, at least in my country, we do a very good job of showing people the hope, of showing people the opportunity, of explaining how communities really look and act and work. And, you know, in my city, the nightly news, it begins with a crime story every night. So what else are you going to think? And you think, oh my God, I might be walking from my mother was one of those people who would lock the door to go get the mail. I never understood that. We weren't in a high crime neighborhood to begin with, but she was so afraid that if she walked down the 20-meter driveway to get the mail, someone was going to slip in the house and be waiting for her when she got back. And why? And I think there's something bigger behind it, and I think that, because I've thought about it a lot, and it doesn't make logical sense. Again, if you look at it empirically, you would not view it the way we do emotionally.
I just want to make just a comment to that.
Can you bring the microphone over there, Thomas?
Sorry. When you say, it doesn't make sense.
Hold
and
on just 1 second.
I
We
totally
can't
agree
hear
with
you.
you. I'm Susan Morrissey with the Edmonton Social Planning Council. I totally agree with you. It just doesn't make sense that we incarcerate youth and we put them away for petty crimes, and we have jails full of people, and what kind of behavior are they learning, and on and on and on. I guess as you were talking, I was just sort of thinking, from a politician's perspective, it's easier to blame somebody else. It's an easy fix. We'll just lock them up. And yet if you logically think further about that, we lock them up. They're connecting with other individuals who are not necessarily a good influence. And all it is a vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't make, you're right, it just doesn't make sense.
We have to sell the virtual cycle. We have to sell the virtual cycle better.
That's right.
And we have to make sense of it all. And I think that, as I said, I think it's a hard job. We certainly, who am I to talk? I live in a country, in a community where we certainly have, although it's starting to change because we're spending so much on the prison system that, again, people who aren't morally outraged are starting to become economically outraged.
Right.
Because, and then in California, the prison guards union has become the most powerful union in the state. They are more powerful than the teachers union. They're spending more on elections than the teachers. They have become the most powerful union in the state. That's insane.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for 2 more questions. One over there and just one over there. Then we're going to take a break.
My question, how would you, in our government with Harper and with the cuts, and we see that in all programs, how do you get the federal government to engage in this kind of discussion? I know it's a big question when you're dealing with a government who might not believe in it.
Just to give you a bit of Canadian context, George Bush, just think back a few years.
Yeah, although, So I say that because I actually did work with people in the Bush administration who got this stuff. And John Bridgeland, who's his domestic policy advisor, has been a leader on this council, and he has been a leader on the issue of disconnected youth. And so I think the question is, and I think what Bridge has helped us do is give us evidence to make the empirical case, to make the economic case. And I think that we have a I think again, I don't know the politics here well enough to comment on it. I think in the United States, there's certainly people on the more conservative, on the conservative side of the aisle, who get this stuff, and the question is, how do we help them be the best leaders possible on the issue? How do we give them the right information, the right stories, the right data? Last 2 weeks ago, my organization and 2 others sent about 150 young people who were formerly disconnected, who connected through our programs and have gone on to be successes. We sent them to Capitol Hill, and they did over 100 meetings. And they did meetings with Republicans and Democrats. They did across the aisle. And they had very good reception from a lot of very conservative people. So I think part of it is we've got to show them who these people are that they're talking about. They need to experience them, they need to hear their stories, and they need to see the hope in what investing in this population means.
One more question.
Hi, my name is John Beebe. I'm with Pathways to Education. And as an American who recently emigrated here and is now applying for my citizenship here, I appreciate what you're saying about fear and the power of fear. And I wonder for us, because one of the things I've looked at the education compared to the U.S. and Canada, and Canada is doing an extraordinary job of educating our youth. And it's a story that was not told, and I feel like us here in the room, it's easier for us to raise money, to mobilize people by telling about a crisis. And it's very hard to raise money to tell about success. Not that we don't have serious challenges here, not that we don't have really serious issues to address, but I'm wondering how we balance that need to talk about these serious challenges that we face and that we're all here really determined to address, but also
Yeah.
place.
Amen. I mean, if I knew it, I'd write a book about that, and I'd have a bestseller. So I just think, amen, like we need to do that better. And thank you all, and I look forward to talking about leadership and doing a little more interactive conversation after the break. And we're not going to no eye closing at the beginning of that session. So.
Paul Schmitz.